December 1944. Winter presses down on the roads of Belgium and France, where mud, ice, and exhaustion have become permanent fixtures of the Allied advance. At makeshift checkpoints strung along forest roads and bomb-scarred villages, American soldiers stop traffic moving toward the front. This is routine work, papers checked, faces glanced at, engines waved through. Except now, something has changed. The men stepping out of the vehicles look right. The uniforms are American issue, worn in the careless way GIs favor after months in the field. Helmets sit at familiar angles. Boots are scuffed the same way. The accents, when they speak, are close enough. Midwestern vowels, East Coast edges. The easy informality of men who sound like home. Nothing about them should raise alarm. Their papers are correct. Unit designations match the maps. Names are typed, stamped, signed. The documents pass from hand to hand without obvious fault. Yet the guards hesitate, not because of what they see, but because of what they feel. A pause hangs in the air, thin but unmistakable. The war has trained them to notice it. Men are detained anyway. Passwords had once been enough. A challenge spoken in the dark, a reply memorized that morning. Now even that feels insufficient. Words can be learned, faces can be studied, uniforms can be stolen. The war, it seems, has found a way to wear a familiar face. At these checkpoints, suspicion begins to spread faster than gunfire. A delay at one road junction ripples outward. Columns back up, orders arrive late. Officers argue quietly over men who look like their own. Trust, once assumed, is now provisional. The danger is not loud. There are no shots, no alarms. Just questions asked twice. Then 3 times. Then differently. The guards begin to search for something that cannot be forged so easily, something not written on paper or stitched onto fabric. And somewhere along the line, almost casually, someone asks a question no field manual had prepared them for. A question that has nothing to do with rank or unit or serial number. A question drawn from memory, not regulation. In the frozen stillness of a roadside checkpoint, that question begins to decide who is waved through and who is pulled aside. The question is asked without ceremony, not barked like an order, not framed as an accusation. It comes almost casually, as if to fill the silence while papers are handed back. Who won the last World Series? The soldier pauses, only for a moment, long enough to register surprise, long enough for the guard to notice the calculation behind the eyes. The answer arrives, but it arrives late, and lateness, in war, can be as revealing as error. Another man is stopped farther down the road. He is relaxed, confident, irritated by the delay. His uniform fits too well to question. Instead, he is asked something different. Who plays shortstop for the Brooklyn Dodgers? The question lands, oddly, disconnected from the business of armies and maps. The man smiles, then falters. He guesses. The guess is wrong. No weapons are raised, no voices are lifted. Yet something fractures all the same. Confidence drains from posture. The ease with which men have passed through checkpoints dissolves under scrutiny that cannot be answered by training alone. Rank insignia no longer matter. Unit patches lose authority. The war, briefly, stops caring about military hierarchy. Baseball takes its place. For American soldiers, the game is background noise of a lifetime heard on radios, argued over in diners, remembered from summers before the war. Its details are not studied. They are absorbed. They live in reflex and memory. For those who have not lived that life, knowledge must be memorized. And memorization is brittle. The guards begin asking variations. Scores? Positions? Cities? The questions are simple, but they demand belonging rather than fluency. Accent no longer persuades. Correct paperwork no longer protects. Each hesitation tightens the net. Detentions increase. Trucks are pulled aside. Men are separated quietly, without spectacle. The process is almost polite. But behind it lies a realization spreading through the lines. The enemy has learned how to look American, but not how to be American. What was meant to be deception begins to unravel in full view of the very men it was designed to fool. And as word of the question spreads along frozen roads and forest paths, the infiltrators face an enemy they were never briefed to fight. They had prepared for passwords. They had not prepared for memory. The winter offensive, that history would later call the Battle of the Bulge, was built on a single, fragile premise: speed amplified by confusion. In December 1944, German forces pushed through the forests of the Ardennes, betting that surprise could compensate for dwindling fuel, manpower, and time. The terrain was narrow, the weather unforgiving, and the margins thin. Every hour gained mattered. Every delay threatened collapse. German planners understood that the decisive struggle would not only occur at the front. Behind Allied lines, roads converged, supply columns flowed, and orders moved faster than men. If that machinery could be disrupted even briefly, the offensive might gain the momentum it needed to break through. Chaos, carefully applied, could serve as a weapon. The targets were deceptively small: bridges that guided convoys, road signs that pointed divisions in the right direction, orders carried by messengers who assumed the uniforms they saw were trustworthy. None of these required firepower to destroy. They required access, and access depended on trust. In this calculus, confusion became a force multiplier. A single wrong turn could misdirect an entire battalion. A delayed order could stall an advance. A rerouted column could arrive too late to matter. German planners began to imagine a battlefield where disruption replaced destruction, where the enemy's own systems worked against him. From this thinking emerged a special operation, authorized quietly and prepared carefully. It would not announce itself with artillery or armor. It would move ahead of the main advance, unseen, unremarkable, and if successful, indistinguishable from the men it sought to deceive. Its success depended on something unprecedented: perfect imitation. Not just of equipment or language, but of behavior, of confidence, of belonging. The men chosen would be required to pass as American soldiers in the most dangerous place imaginable among Americans themselves. Failure, the planners knew, would not look like a failed attack. There would be no shattered tanks to count, no clear line of retreat. Failure would look like hesitation at a checkpoint, like a delay on a frozen road, like panic spreading quietly through friendly lines. And if that panic took hold, the damage would already be done. To German planners, the Allied rear areas appeared soft. Months of rapid advance had conditioned American forces to think forward, not inward. Supply routes flowed smoothly. Checkpoints were procedural. Rear echelon troops were accustomed to movement, not scrutiny. In Berlin and field headquarters alike, this rhythm was interpreted as complacency, not discipline, but habit. American doctrine prized speed. Columns moved quickly to exploit breakthroughs, trusting that friendly uniforms meant friendly intent. Orders were often delivered by jeep, not escort. Maps changed faster than protocols. In this environment, German planners saw vulnerability. If movement was the lifeblood of the Allied advance, then hesitation introduced quietly could prove fatal. The solution they devised reflected a particular set of priorities. Combat power was secondary. Firepower would only reveal the deception. Instead, language skills were elevated above marksmanship. Men were selected not for aggression, but for pronunciation. English fluency became the primary weapon. The operation would succeed not by fighting Americans, but by passing among them. Captured equipment reinforced this confidence. American uniforms, weapons, vehicles, and maps had already fallen into German hands during the chaos of earlier fighting. Issued correctly, these artifacts promised visual authenticity. To the planners, appearance was proof. If a soldier looked American and sounded American, the assumption followed that he would be accepted as American. Numbers were limited, but surprise was expected to compensate. The operation was never meant to overwhelm. It was meant to confuse, to arrive early, quietly, and disappear before suspicion could coalesce. A small force, applied at precisely the wrong moment, might create delays far out of proportion to its size. This was the logic of economy, sharpened by desperation. Psychological shock occupied a central place in the planning. The goal was not destruction, but doubt. If American units could be made to question orders, to hesitate at intersections, to argue over directions, then the offensive would gain precious hours. Confusion itself became the decisive arm. Panic, once introduced, would propagate without further effort. What remained underestimated were the details no map recorded. Cultural habits, informal speech, the unspoken rhythms of everyday life that soldiers carried with them even into combat. German planners assumed these were trivial ornaments, not defenses. They believed identity could be assembled from components: uniform, language, paperwork. That belonging could be worn. On paper, the plan aligned perfectly with circumstance. It promised disproportionate effect at minimal cost. It avoided direct confrontation. It exploited speed, surprise, and confidence. For a command facing material shortages and strategic pressure, it appeared elegant. What the paper could not show was the difference between knowing facts and living them, between speaking a language and inhabiting a culture, between imitation and memory. And it was in that unseen space that the plan's brilliance would begin to fail quietly, one question at a time. The operation was given a name that concealed its intent behind abstraction. Operation Greif did not begin with gunfire or movement at the front. It began in training areas far from Allied observation, where a small group of hand-picked German soldiers stood in unfamiliar uniforms, adjusting collars that did not belong to them. American field jackets replaced German wool. Helmets sat differently. The fabric felt wrong, but convincing enough at a distance. Equipment followed the uniforms. Captured jeeps were repainted and tuned. American weapons were issued, not for their firepower, but for their appearance and sound. Maps were studied in English, with road names memorized as if they were lines of poetry. Every detail was curated to reduce friction at the moment of contact. The goal was not to fight, but to pass. Language training consumed most of the preparation. English phrases were drilled repeatedly, stripped down to the casual shorthand of American soldiers. Not formal grammar, but slang, abbreviations, and rhythm. Men practiced speaking while walking, while driving, while tired. Mistakes were corrected, accents were softened. Fluency, it was believed, would open doors. Yet the missions themselves remained deliberately vague. Objectives were framed broadly: misdirect traffic, alter signs, delay movement. Specific targets were often withheld. The men were told that initiative would matter more than precision. They would be judged not by territory taken, but by disruption caused. Ambiguity was treated as flexibility, not risk. Orders emphasized avoidance. Engagement was to be a last resort. A firefight would expose the deception instantly. The uniform was a shield only as long as it remained unquestioned. Survival depended on restraint. The men were instructed to act annoyed rather than aggressive, impatient rather than alert. They were to blend into the flow of an army that prided itself on informality. In this environment, identity itself became the battlefield. The operation did not measure success in miles advanced or enemy casualties. It measured it in seconds of hesitation, in wrong turns taken, in orders delayed just long enough to matter. Each interaction was a test of performance. Each checkpoint, an audition. Confidence rested on surface-level imitation. The planners believed that authenticity could be assembled through repetition, that habits could be learned quickly. That culture was a set of facts rather than a lived accumulation. The men selected were intelligent, disciplined, and motivated. They trusted their preparation, so did their commanders. What was less acknowledged was the fragility of the disguise. The uniforms concealed rank, not memory. The language conveyed meaning, not belonging. Beneath the careful rehearsal lay an assumption that Americans would see what they expected to see and ask no further questions. As the infiltrators moved forward into the chaos of the Ardennes, they carried that assumption with them. It was light, invisible, and untested. And like many assumptions made in war, it would not survive first contact, not with the enemy, but with familiarity. At the center of the operation stood Otto Skorzeny, a man whose reputation had been forged by audacity. His earlier successes had rewarded boldness and improvisation, reinforcing a belief that daring could compensate for imbalance. To Skorzeny, The problem of deception was not philosophical. It was technical. And technical problems, he believed, could be solved. He assumed authenticity could be engineered, that the right materials, applied correctly, would produce the desired result. Uniforms were not symbols in this calculation, they were mechanisms. Put one on, and a transformation occurred. The man inside ceased to be German and became, for all practical purposes, American. The fabric did the work. The rest was detail. Language, too, was treated as access. If a soldier could speak English well enough, doors would open, accents could be softened, vocabulary expanded, pronunciation refined. To Skorzeny, speech was a key, and fluency the cut that made it fit the lock. Once inside, everything else would follow naturally. What he underestimated was culture, not as knowledge, but as accumulation. American informality was misread as simplicity. The relaxed posture, the casual speech, the absence of rigid ceremony, all suggested a society that was easy to imitate. Skorzeny mistook looseness for shallowness. He did not see the depth beneath it. The operation assumed details could be memorized. Names of cities, popular expressions, military slang, sports teams. The men were drilled in lists and phrases, tested repeatedly until answers came quickly. But memory learned under instruction behaves differently from memory earned through living. One responds on command, the other responds without thinking. This distinction mattered more than planners realized. American soldiers did not check their identity consciously. They carried it unconsciously, expressed in habits too small to rehearse. The way they complained, the way they joked, the references they made without explanation. These were not details to them. They were background noise. And background noise is the hardest thing to fake. Skorzeny believed that identity could be assembled from parts, that appearance plus language equaled belonging. In doing so, he reduced something organic into something mechanical. The operation reflected this reduction. It focused on what could be seen, heard, and verified quickly. What it ignored was what surfaced only under pressure. The danger of the assumption lay not in arrogance alone, but in confidence untested by doubt. Success in previous unconventional missions had taught Skorzeny to trust bold design over cautious skepticism. It had not taught him where imitation ends and intuition begins. As Operation Greif moved forward, its architect remained convinced that the disguise would hold long enough to matter, that Americans would see themselves reflected back and look no deeper. That familiarity would breed acceptance. What he did not fully consider was how familiarity also breeds instinct. And instinct, once triggered, does not ask for credentials. At first, the disguise holds. The infiltrators move forward in small groups, slipping into the arteries of the Allied rear as the Ardennes offensive gathers momentum. At checkpoints, they slow just enough to appear inconvenienced, not nervous. Papers are handed over with practiced irritation. English comes easily, now short sentences. Casual complaints, familiar impatience, guards glance, nod, and wave them through. No alarms sound, no questions linger. Each successful passage reinforces belief. The men begin to trust the uniform, the accent, the performance. Confidence settles in, quiet but intoxicating. The war, for a moment, seems to be bending around them. Their work begins subtly. Road signs are altered with care, an arrow turned, a destination swapped, a distance changed just enough to matter. It takes seconds. The signs look right because they are right, only wrong in direction. No explosives. No sabotage that leaves scars. Just quiet misdirection. Convoys follow the signs without hesitation. Trucks drift onto secondary roads. Units arrive late or not at all. Drivers argue briefly, consult maps, then commit to a path that feels correct. Each wrong turn compounds the next. The landscape itself becomes misleading. Orders, too, are delayed or distorted. Messages are passed verbally, repeated with slight alterations that seem like misunderstandings rather than intent. A time changes, a location shifts, a priority softens. None of it is dramatic enough to challenge outright. All of it is enough to slow momentum. Confusion spreads faster than resistance because it does not announce itself. There is no enemy to fire upon, no clear act of aggression. Officers sense something amiss, but cannot yet define it. Delays are attributed to weather, traffic, exhaustion. War, after all, is always messy. The infiltrators rely on that assumption. Reports filter back through German channels, cautious at first, then increasingly confident. Roadblocks bypassed. Columns delayed. Movements disrupted. The language of success is measured, but unmistakable. The operation, it appears, is achieving precisely what it was designed to do. The men in American uniforms begin to feel the strange safety of invisibility. They sit in captured jeeps at intersections, giving directions they know are wrong. They joke lightly. They complain about rations. They blend into the endless flow of soldiers moving toward the front. For hours at a time, no one looks twice. Innovation emerges not from new tactics, but from adaptation. The infiltrators learn which tones persuade and which provoke suspicion. They shorten conversations. They avoid questions rather than answer them. They learn when to move quickly and when to linger. Each interaction becomes a lesson, stored and applied. The absence of immediate consequence is misleading. Success creates momentum, but also exposure. Each altered sign affects dozens of vehicles. Each delayed order touches multiple units. The footprint of the deception expands invisibly, overlapping itself. The operation is no longer contained. It is woven into the daily functioning of the Allied rear. With success comes a subtle shift in behavior. Some infiltrators take risks they would have avoided earlier. They stay longer at checkpoints. They give directions more freely. Confidence, once a tool, becomes an assumption. And assumptions invite scrutiny. American soldiers begin comparing notes. A convoy that should have arrived hours ago appears unexpectedly from the wrong direction. Orders conflict without explanation. Familiar routes feel unfamiliar. The confusion that once seemed like background noise begins to acquire a shape. Still, for the moment, the deception appears to be working. The infiltrators have not been unmasked. No coordinated response emerges. German command sees evidence of delay and disruption and reads it as validation. The plan, so elegant on paper, seems equally effective in the field. What no report can yet capture is the change occurring quietly at the checkpoints. The slight narrowing of eyes. The extra seconds spent listening. The realization, forming independently in different places, that something is wrong but not yet what. The operation has gained time. It has not yet gained safety. The first signs are administrative, not tactical. Orders arrive that contradict one another, each stamped with authority, each plausible on its own. A unit is told to advance, then told to hold. Another is redirected twice within the same hour. No single message seems alarming. Taken together, they form a pattern that resists explanation. Units begin arriving where they should not be. Trucks appear at intersections marked on no schedule. Columns materialize from directions that maps insist are wrong. Officers study their paperwork again, assuming error. They radio for clarification and wait longer than expected for replies. The delays feel ordinary. The accumulation does not. Familiar procedures start to break down under the weight of small inconsistencies. Convoys that once flowed smoothly now hesitate. Drivers argue quietly over routes they have driven for weeks. Staff officers revise plans mid-movement. The machinery of the advance continues to operate, but with friction where none existed before. It is not chaos yet, it is discomfort. Experienced officers begin noticing what cannot be written in reports. Men who speak English correctly, but not effortlessly. Soldiers who know where they are going, but not why. Answers that satisfy on the surface, then linger awkwardly in the air. These are not mistakes that training corrects. They are absences, things missing rather than things wrong. Suspicion replaces routine almost imperceptibly. Guards linger longer at checkpoints. Conversations stretch beyond necessity. Papers are checked twice, then once more for reasons that cannot be articulated. No one announces a new protocol. It emerges on its own, shaped by unease rather than command. Improvised security measures appear independently across the lines. Units begin asking questions not listed in any manual. Questions drawn from memory, from shared experience, from a life lived before the war. The inquiries vary, but the logic behind them is the same. Ask what cannot be rehearsed quickly. Trust becomes conditional. A uniform no longer guarantees passage. An accent no longer ends scrutiny. Even familiarity is no longer sufficient without confirmation. The war has shifted, quietly, from one of movement to one of verification. Progress slows, but awareness sharpens. This vigilance carries its own cost. Delays increase. Tempers shorten. Men resent being questioned by those they consider peers. Yet the questioning continues, driven by instinct rather than policy. The sense of threat is diffuse, but real. Something is moving through the rear, and it does not belong. Word spreads informally, not through orders, but through conversation. At mess lines, at roadblocks, in the margins of briefings. Soldiers share what they have noticed, what felt wrong, what made them pause. Each story reinforces the next. The picture clarifies without ever being fully drawn. What the infiltrators relied upon, speed, habit, assumption, now works against them. The environment they entered adapts. The American rear, once fluid and permissive, becomes alert in a way no plan anticipated. Not rigid, but watchful. Not fearful, but inquisitive. This shift is not the result of a single discovery. It is the product of many small recognitions aligning. The moment when familiarity stops protecting and starts interrogating. When ease gives way to attention, and as that attention sharpens, it demands a test simple enough to ask anywhere, personal enough to matter, and decisive enough to cut through the noise. The search is not for proof, but for certainty. American soldiers understand instinctively that rank and paperwork can be forged, rehearsed, memorized. They have already seen it happen. What they need now is a test that requires no preparation time, no equipment, and no official sanction. Something immediate, something human. At first, they try formality. Serial numbers, unit histories, names of commanding officers. These questions fail as quickly as they are asked. Too many answers sound correct. Too many mistakes can be explained away by fatigue or confusion. The war has taught them that plausibility is not the same as truth. Gradually, attention shifts away from the military entirely. The realization comes unevenly, in different places at different times, but it follows the same logic. If identity has been copied, then verification must come from somewhere else. From the shared life that existed before the uniform. Baseball fills that space naturally. It is not chosen because it is official, but because it is common. It belongs to no unit, no region alone. It is discussed casually in trucks, argued over in mess lines, remembered from summers now years away. For American soldiers, baseball is not trivia. It is background memory. The first questions are asked lightly, almost as jokes. Who won the last World Series? How did the Yankees do this year? Who plays shortstop for Brooklyn? The tone is relaxed, conversational. The guards watch not just the answers, but the reaction to the question itself. Correct accents begin to fail without correct answers. Some men answer confidently and are wrong. Others hesitate, searching their memory for something that should already be there. The pauses are subtle but revealing. Memory does not pause to consult itself. It responds. As the questions spread, their tone changes. What begins as curiosity becomes procedure. Checkpoints adopt the practice independently, without orders or instruction. The questions vary, but the intent remains constant. Ask something that cannot be learned overnight. Detentions multiply. Men are pulled aside quietly, without accusation. Some protest mildly, irritated more than afraid. Others grow defensive too quickly. The guards listen carefully, noting not just what is said, but how. The net tightens not through force, but through repetition. For the infiltrators, the ground shifts abruptly. The disguise they trusted no longer protects them. They can feel the scrutiny even before the questions are asked. Conversations become tests. Casual remarks carry weight. Every interaction risks exposure. The irony is sharp. The operation was designed to exploit American informality. Now that same informality is being weaponized against it. Jokes become interrogations, small talk becomes surveillance. The culture that seemed shallow reveals its depth precisely because it is shared. Word travels fast. Soldiers warn one another what to ask, what to listen for. The questions grow sharper, more specific. Scores, positions, trades, details that cannot be guessed convincingly. The margin for error disappears. What had once been a clever deception now feels crowded, claustrophobic. Escape routes close. The roads themselves seem hostile. Each checkpoint is a risk. Each mile traveled increases the chance of being stopped again. The deception is no longer collapsing quietly. It is being dismantled openly, one question at a time. And as detentions rise and confidence drains, the infiltrators confront a truth their planners never accounted for. They had prepared answers. They had not prepared memories. What had begun as informal caution hardens into practice. Checkpoints that once waved vehicles through now halt entire columns. Trucks idle in the cold as soldiers step down one by one. Papers are checked, then set aside. The questions come next, asked patiently, without urgency, as if time itself has become a weapon. The delays ripple outward, advancing units lose their rhythm. Timidabbles unravel. A battalion that should have moved at dawn is still waiting at noon. Radios crackle with requests for clarification that receive no immediate reply. The offensive does not stop, but it stutters. And in a battle built on momentum, stutter is danger. For the infiltrators, the change is immediate and unforgiving. Mid-mission, often within sight of objectives they have already compromised, they are exposed by answers that come too late or not at all. The disguise that carried them through hours of movement now fails in seconds. There is no opportunity to recover, no second attempt. Some are captured without resistance. Hands rise instinctively, not in fear, but in recognition that the performance is over. They are separated from the column quietly, escorted away by men who look no different from those they sought to deceive. The absence of violence is striking. The deception ends not with gunfire, but with compliance. Others attempt escape. A sudden turn off the road, a dash through trees, a jeep abandoned at speed. These efforts rarely succeed. The landscape is unfamiliar. The roads are watched. The moment the disguise is compromised, mobility vanishes. Shots are fired, brief and decisive. The pursuit is short. As detentions multiply, the scale of the operation becomes visible for the first time to both sides. German command receives fragmented reports of missing teams, failed contacts, unexplained silence. What had seemed like a series of small successes now reads differently. The infiltrators are not merely delayed, they are being removed from the field. The operation slows catastrophically. Without infiltrators ahead, confusion can no longer be sustained. Altered signs are corrected. Misdirected convoys are rerouted. Orders regain coherence. The brief window during which uncertainty favored the attacker closes rapidly. Time, once borrowed, is reclaimed. The reversal is subtle but complete. Confusion does not vanish, it changes sides. German units advancing through the Ardennes now face the same delays they sought to impose. Traffic jams form. Fuel runs low. Orders arrive too late. The machinery of the offensive grinds against its own limits. At the checkpoints, the process continues methodically. Soldiers ask questions, listen, decide. The system refines itself. Fewer detentions are needed as the infiltrators are filtered out. What remains is a rear area that is slower, more cautious, but once again, aligned with itself. The turning point is not marked by a single event, but by a realization spreading through the ranks. The threat has been understood. Not eliminated by force, but neutralized by attention. The Americans have adapted faster than the deception can. For the men who planned Operation Greif, this is the moment when ambition meets consequence. The plan does not collapse all at once. It bleeds out through delays, captures, and missed opportunities. Its effects diminish hour by hour. By the time the last infiltrators are hunted down or taken into custody, the question has already been answered, not the one asked at checkpoints, but the one at the heart of the operation. Whether identity can be borrowed convincingly enough to change the course of a battle? At the roadside, engines restart. Columns move again, and the war resumes its familiar shape, altered, but intact. The collapse of the deception does not immediately restore calm. Instead, it releases something more volatile. Once suspicion has been learned, it does not retreat easily. American soldiers, having discovered that the enemy could move among them undetected, begin to look at one another differently. The question is no longer who is out there, but who is standing beside me. Checkpoints remain active, but scrutiny spreads beyond them. Conversations are shorter. Familiar faces are studied more closely. Men who have shared foxholes now hesitate before trusting directions or instructions. The uniform, once a guarantee of belonging, has lost its authority. Vigilance hardens into doubt. Friendly fire incidents increase, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. A sudden movement at night. A shouted command misunderstood. A hesitation that lasts too long. Shots are fired reflexively, then regretted instantly. Investigations follow, but explanations offer little comfort. The enemy may no longer be infiltrating, but the damage to trust remains. Morale wavers under the weight of uncertainty. Soldiers are trained to face danger from ahead, not from within. The strain of constant verification exhausts units already worn thin by cold, fatigue, and loss. Men begin to resent the suspicion even as they participate in it. The war feels suddenly unfamiliar. Command struggles to restore order without undoing vigilance. Orders are issued reminding troops of identification procedures, urging restraint, emphasizing discipline. But the situation resists regulation. Fear has become decentralized. It does not wait for instruction. It responds to instinct. Efficiency drops despite heightened awareness. Movements slow. Decisions take longer. Every interaction carries a margin of doubt. The rear areas, once fluid and fast-moving, become cautious and fragmented. In this way, the deception achieves a final, unintended success. Even in failure, it extracts a cost. For a brief period, the German plan works in another way. Not by infiltration, but by after-effect. The psychological residue lingers. The Americans have adapted, but adaptation itself has consequences. Time is lost, energy is drained, attention is diverted inward. Gradually, control begins to return. Not through force, but through repetition. As days pass without new infiltrators uncovered, suspicion begins to loosen its grip. The questions remain, but the tone softens. The checks continue, but they no longer carry the same edge. Familiarity, carefully rebuilt, starts to reassert itself. Command reinforces clarity. Units are reoriented. Procedures are standardized again. The informal networks of rumor give way to official channels. Confidence returns not as assumption, but as earned trust. The rear regains its rhythm, slower than before, but steadier. What remains is memory. The knowledge that the enemy once stood close enough to pass unnoticed. That certainty can be an illusion. That vigilance, once awakened, changes how a force sees itself. The Americans emerge from the episode altered, not shaken apart, but sharpened. The moment of inward fear passes. The war moves on. But the lesson does not fade as quickly as the checkpoints. It settles into doctrine, into habit, into the quiet understanding that identity is not proven once, but continually reaffirmed. And long after the roads clear and the questions stop being asked, the experience leaves behind a deeper awareness. The most dangerous disruptions are not always those that destroy, but those that make a force doubt itself even briefly. In retrospect, the limits were always there. The number of infiltrators was small by design, intended to move quietly rather than overwhelm. That restraint was necessary for concealment, but it also ensured that the operation could never achieve decisive scale. A handful of men could delay columns and misdirect convoys, but they could not sustain disruption across an entire front once attention sharpened. Numbers mattered more than planners admitted. Each infiltrator could influence a moment, a junction, an order. But once exposed, There were no replacements waiting to take their place. Attrition, even without combat, reduced the operation's reach rapidly. What began as a distributed threat became a shrinking presence, easy to isolate and contain. More decisive still was culture. Cultural depth cannot be improvised because it is not a checklist. It is not a set of facts stored and retrieved on demand. It is accumulation formed through repetition, contradiction, and shared experience. The operation treated culture as surface detail, when in reality it functioned as a structural defense. Language fluency, so carefully cultivated, proved insufficient. The infiltrators spoke English well enough to be understood, but not well enough to be invisible. Fluency opened conversations. It did not carry them. Under pressure, speech revealed effort. Pauses lengthened. Answers arrived with calculation instead of instinct. Language, stripped of context, exposed rather than concealed. American society itself complicated the deception further. It was not uniform. Regional differences, local references, and informal knowledge varied widely, even among Americans. What sounded plausible in one place rang hollow in another. The infiltrators faced not a single cultural standard, but many overlapping ones. Memorization could not keep pace. Memory outperformed rehearsal every time. Men who had lived the references did not search for them. They recalled them unconsciously. The difference was subtle, but decisive. Memory moved faster than memorization, especially when questions were asked unexpectedly. In those moments, preparation collapsed under the weight of immediacy. Deception, by its nature, scaled poorly. Each additional checkpoint increased exposure. Each successful passage increased the likelihood of scrutiny later. The more the infiltrators moved, the more they were noticed, not individually, but as a pattern. What relied on invisibility could not survive attention. Scrutiny, once applied, was relentless. The American response did not depend on a single method or authority. It emerged organically, adapting faster than the deception could. Questions changed. Procedures evolved. The environment became hostile to imitation. The operation had no answer for adaptation beyond what had already been prepared. Under that scrutiny, the plot collapsed. Not with drama, but with inevitability. Captures increased. Silence replaced reports. Objectives went unmet. The deception ceased to function, not because it was exposed once, but because it could not stop being exposed repeatedly. What remained was the lesson. That identity is not worn, but lived. That culture resists shortcuts. That familiarity, once questioned, becomes a powerful filter. The operation failed because it misunderstood the nature of what it sought to copy. And in that failure lay a broader truth of modern warfare. Deception can open doors, but it cannot occupy a home. For the men captured at checkpoints and roadside halts, the war narrows suddenly. They are taken away from the noise of movement and placed into rooms where time stretches. Interrogations begin almost immediately. Questions are methodical, repeated, cross-checked. Names, units, routes, intentions. The Americans are no longer searching for suspicion, they are assembling clarity. The legal status of the prisoners proves uncertain from the start. They wore enemy uniforms, but not their own. They carried weapons, but had often avoided using them. Some insist they were soldiers operating under orders. Others say nothing at all. The distinction between combatant and spy, clear in theory, blurs in practice. For some, the consequences are severe. Wearing an enemy uniform behind the lines has long been treated as espionage, not soldiering. Courts convene quickly. Evidence is simple. Verdicts follow. Executions are carried out with efficiency and restraint, without ceremony. The men disappear from the war as quietly as they entered it. Others are spared not out of leniency, but utility. Those with language skills, operational knowledge, or insight into German planning are retained for intelligence. They are questioned repeatedly, sometimes over weeks. Their answers help confirm what the Americans already suspect. The scale of the operation was limited, its ambitions larger than its reach. As intelligence is extracted, interest wanes. The operation has failed. There are no follow-on actions to prepare for, no second wave to anticipate. What remains is documentation reports written, lessons noted, files closed. The infiltrators become footnotes to a larger battle still unfolding. The tangible gains of the operation are negligible. No bridges permanently destroyed, no headquarters seized, no breakthrough achieved. The brief confusion caused is measured and then absorbed. The Ardennes offensive continues, shaped far more by logistics and weather than by deception. The psychological impact, so pronounced in the moment, fades quickly. Fear burns hot but briefly. Once the infiltrators are accounted for, American units return their attention forward. The enemy resumes a familiar shape. Trust, though altered, is rebuilt. The questions stop being asked. Reality replaces fear. Soldiers remember the episode as a strange interlude, unsettling but contained. It becomes a story told after the fact, stripped of urgency, shaped by hindsight. The war moves on, indifferent to failed experiments. For the planners who conceived the operation, there is little reckoning beyond silence. The idea is not repeated at scale. The costs are understood, the limits acknowledged. In a conflict increasingly defined by material superiority and attrition, deception of this kind proves unsustainable. The infiltrators themselves are left with the knowledge that their mission ended not in combat but exposure, that they were undone not by firepower but by familiarity. The uniforms they wore so carefully could not protect them once the questions began. In the end, Operation Greif leaves behind no monuments and claims no victories. Its legacy is instructional rather than inspirational. It demonstrates what happens when imitation meets lived experience and loses. The fear it generated vanishes almost as quickly as it appeared. What remains is understanding. And understanding, once gained, does not frighten easily again. The question itself was ordinary. It carried no authority, no threat. It did not belong to doctrine or intelligence manuals, and yet it accomplished what weapons and uniforms could not. It revealed a truth the operation had tried to deny. Culture is not cosmetic. Culture does not sit on the surface, waiting to be copied. It accumulates slowly, through repetition and contradiction, through habits formed long before they are ever tested. The baseball question worked not because it was clever, but because it was unconscious. It drew from memory rather than preparation. And memory, unlike rehearsal, does not hesitate. Identity, the episode demonstrated, is cumulative. It is not performed convincingly under pressure unless it has been lived without effort. The infiltrators could mimic tone and posture. They could recite facts. But they could not summon the reflexes of belonging. When asked something that mattered only because it was shared, they revealed distance. What followed was not a coordinated innovation, but a subconscious defense. American soldiers did not design a counterintelligence system. They recognized one. They sensed what was wrong and responded with what was familiar. The society they carried with them, informal, fragmented, deeply internalized, began defending itself without instruction. This was the failure at the heart of the deception. It assumed that experience could be compressed, that life could be learned the way procedures are learned. But lived experience resists shortcuts. Without it, deception becomes fragile, exposed the moment conditions change. The episode expanded the definition of warfare. It showed that conflict does not stop at weapons, terrain, or numbers. It extends into memory, language, and shared reference. Into the spaces armies rarely measure, but always inhabit. The battlefield was not just the Ardennes, it was identity itself. The smallest details proved decisive, not because they were obscure, but because they were embedded. A team name, a position, a score remembered without effort. These details mattered precisely because no one thought they mattered. They were not guarded, and therefore they could not be breached. In this sense, the baseball question marked a quiet turning point, not only in the failure of Operation Greif, but in how modern forces understood security. Counterintelligence did not emerge here as a new technology, but as an awareness that the most effective defenses are often cultural rather than mechanical. The lesson endured. Armies would continue to study deception, disguise, and infiltration. but they would also learn to respect what cannot be easily replicated. That identity, when shared deeply enough, becomes a filter no uniform can pass through for long. The episode passed quickly in operational terms, but its implications lasted. It demonstrated that societies do not only defend themselves through force, they do so through familiarity, through memory, through the unspoken knowledge of who belongs. In the end, the question mattered not because it stopped the infiltrators, but because it revealed why they were always destined to fail.
Years later, veterans would remember the episode without embellishment. There was no appetite for drama in the recollection, no stories of heroics or clever triumph. What stayed with them was the tension. Quiet, sustained, and difficult to explain to anyone who had not been there. It was not fear of Germans that lingered. They knew how to face an enemy in front of them. It was fear of uncertainty, of realizing that the line between friend and foe could blur without warning, that familiarity itself could be questioned. The war, for a brief moment, had turned inward. In that moment, a game decided trust, not strategy, not doctrine, not technology. A game played on summer afternoons, discussed in barbershops and kitchens, carried across oceans in memory. Baseball became the measure not because it was important, but because it was shared. A single question exposed intent, not through accusation, but through absence. The inability to answer revealed not ignorance, but distance. The distance between knowing about a culture and belonging to it, between performance and instinct. Uniforms lost their meaning. Fabric and insignia, once symbols of certainty, became unreliable. Authority shifted away from what could be seen and toward what could be sensed. Identity stopped being declared and started being tested. The plot did not die by force. It was not crushed by firepower or overwhelmed by numbers. It dissolved under familiarity, under the quiet strength of shared experience that no training could replicate fully. The deception failed not because it was poorly conceived, but because it misunderstood what it sought to imitate. For the Americans, the episode passed quickly, absorbed into the larger weight of the war. But it left behind an understanding that endured, that the smallest details can matter most, that societies carry defenses they do not consciously design, that memory can be as decisive as machinery. For the men who planned and executed the operation, the lesson was harsher. They had mastered the uniform. They had memorized the language. They had memorized the language. They had studied the appearance of an enemy. What they never mastered was the culture that made that enemy coherent. In the end, the battlefield was not just the frozen forests of the Ardennes. It was the space between imitation and identity, a space where preparation ends and belonging begins. And in that space, the war delivered one of its quieter verdicts. You can learn how a people dress, how they speak, how they move, but without living their life, you will always hesitate when the question comes. They mastered the uniform. They never mastered the culture.